it's absolutely the time for the coalition of the willing, I think Keir Starmer is calling it, to step up and really show its mettle, because that is the only way that Putin is going to be stopped in his tracks.
So, Hamish, if I can start by asking you, there have been further attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure overnight. To all the world, it looks like an immediate violation of what Putin had agreed with Donald Trump. And if Putin is playing a game, how risky is that kind of move?
Well, I think this move is incredibly risky, but I don't think anybody should be too surprised. We just have to look at what has happened recently. And certainly, as I've been writing about it for the last 2 or 3 days, we need to look at exactly what Putin has said and what he is trying to achieve here. And because he hasn't achieved what he wants the complete subjugation of Ukraine back into Russia. He wants all the 4 oblasts, which he part controls now and Crimea, recognised by the international community. He wants no further military aid to Ukraine. All of this is completely unacceptable. But, I understand, and I believe Western intelligence agencies believe that Putin thinks that he can win this war, and he thinks he's winning. And actually, if you look at it on the ground, he's made a lot of strides in Kursk recently. I was talking to people over the weekend in Petrovsk, where they're making huge gains, and Russia's using a huge amount of chemical weapons, which is not even making the media, which is quite astounding. So when it came to the discussions yesterday, the much vaunted Trump-Putin phone call, and Trump, of course, has been telling us now, really since he came into power, that he'd sort this war out in 24 hours. If we look at the last 24 hours, one has to come to the conclusion that Trump just does not have the capabilities or the desire to force Putin into a peace, because what Ukraine agreed in Saudi Arabia last week is a 30-day ceasefire. This was put to the Russians, and even Trump, after Saudi, said it's in Putin's hands now. An hour and a half call between the president of the United States and the president of the Russian Federation, and they seem to agree a 30-day ceasefire, which would only include not attacking power infrastructure and infrastructure. But literally, even before Putin had put the phone down, it would appear that Russian missiles and drones were headed towards Ukraine infrastructure and power infrastructure, and a hospital was hit. So, I am not at all surprised. I don't think it would appear, Putin is not to be trusted. And, those of us who've been looking and studying this for some time would say that. And Trump just does not have the power that he thinks that he has. So it's incredibly dangerous. I think the key message really is to us in Europe. We've already realised that the US is no longer the reliable ally that will guarantee peace in Europe, and in a way Trump's woken us up to our own shortcomings. But the last 24 hours have shown us we must get on. Peace is not just going to happen. A ceasefire is not going to happen. We are going to have to make it happen, and we must remember that it's the last thing on Putin's mind at the moment. Whatever hot air is coming out of Trump and his key people, and whatever is coming out of Moscow, there seems to be no desire. And if people, question that, just look at what's happened since the end of that phone call. And we must act accordingly. And military chiefs in Europe are meeting in London tomorrow to discuss, well, they were discussing how to organise and police the ceasefire. Now, I think they need to discuss how to try and bring about that ceasefire and enforce it if necessary.
It's interesting, the whole dynamics around that conversation. Indeed, Russian bloggers, it's quoted in the Times that they think Putin ran rings around Trump. So everything that you're saying about that, if I could just push you a little bit further on, sort of, many believe we've said in this podcast on Times before that Putin's trying to stall and buy time. Given each week that passes, Russia's position on the battlefield gets a tiny bit stronger. He doesn't want a ceasefire at all. He doesn't want peace. You share that view. What point, going on a little bit more about what point do you think that Donald Trump will realise that too, if at all?
Well, Yeah, let's hope it's sooner rather than later. I rather thought last night when I was reading about this on the Times and looking at the BBC, it was a real 1939 moment. Unfortunately, Trump is acting like Chamberlain, and sadly not like Churchill, who he claims to be. And I think that is absolutely, how it is at the moment. There is no way that Putin wants a ceasefire. Let's not forget that the Russians have just passed 1 million casualties, you know, and the proportion of those are actually dead Russians. And let's not forget that it was the mothers of Russia back in 1984 when Russia lost 17,000 dead in Afghanistan that forced the Kremlin to withdraw. Putin knows he's in for a massive awakening once that becomes a fact. Putin also knows that his economy, apart from building tanks and making weapons, is in a dire position. If peace does break out, it's not going to just be the mothers of Russia that are going to damn Putin. It's going to be his economy that is going to crumble. So there are so many reasons why Putin does not want peace and will keep going and thinks that he will be successful. And with the US backing off, and we all know the US military power, military might, is the thing that has kept Putin back and held him back. But now with a sympathetic ear of Trump, it's not surprising. I look at it with my military hat on, and if I was making military decisions and I was Putin, I would absolutely be doing what he's doing, pushing forward, because he knows that the European military, although we are very powerful, but at the moment we're sort of disjointed and not acting together. This is his opportunity, and it goes back to what he wants to achieve. He wants Ukraine, with all the four oblasts, all the 20% he's already taken. He wants a whole place back into Russia. Yeah, and as I wrote in the Telegraph at the weekend, he actually wants to build a Soviet Union. One of his stipulations for peace was to have NATO back to 1997 boundaries, which would mean the Baltic states, the Nordic states, places like Romania and Bulgaria out of NATO. Now, sitting here in the UK, that is absolutely unachievable. But with what's happening in the States at the moment, and if you're sat in the Kremlin, you probably think that it is achievable. So it's absolutely the time for the coalition of the willing, I think Keir Starmer is calling it, to step up and really show its mettle, because that is the only way that Putin is going to be stopped in his tracks.
So looking now in terms of what Europe will do now, we mentioned the meetings. There are plans to arm Ukraine in defiance of Putin. If Europe were to do that and then be in a scenario where they're actively frustrating Donald Trump's attempts at peace, where does that then take international relations with the US in this massive jigsaw puzzle of international relations?
Well, I think, first of all, Trump and Putin are really changing the world order and the rules-based order that we've all become used to, which has sort of kept the peace. So that it is a fine balance. I think we've got to realise in Europe that we are very much low down Trump's list of things to do, unless it's to do with, some economic deal. The only thing that really seems to interest Trump in Ukraine is rare earth minerals. But again, Putin's told Trump he can have them anyway. So I think we just need to absolutely face reality here. When it comes to what we do next, collectively, the NATO European countries are actually militarily very significant. But hitherto, we've been disjointed. But with the addition of Finland and Sweden in particular, it does give us the military might and mass that can really match Russia. And I hope when the generals meet in London tomorrow, they were originally going to war game how they'd run a peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Although, of course, Putin has said no NATO troops in Ukraine at all. They now need to work out how they're going to try and enforce a ceasefire with Trump staying his side of the Atlantic, as it were. And that's going to be a real challenge. But there's talk of some sort of air shield, air power, European air power of about 120 plus fighter jets. which, if we can bring that together, I personally believe that that would be sufficient to create the air superiority over Ukraine that is required. It's quite clear as well that, when we look at military hardware, tanks, artillery, drones, between the UK and France, the Baltic states, the Nordic states, again, we do have the capability to put it together. And the other thing that is advantage to European NATO countries is we're all pretty well trained. The Russian army on the ground at the moment is a mass of conscripts who are really just thrown into the meat grinder. These are young boys, mainly men, or almost entirely men, who are given a couple of weeks training, and virtually all they can do is march into the enemy. Of course, Russia does have some pretty smart drones and missiles, but again, against a sort of European NATO capability, if we go all in, that should be sufficient. Now, I'm not saying that NATO countries at this stage should put masses of tanks into Ukraine to oppose Putin. It is about showing strength. We know Putin exploits weakness and respects strength. If Putin believes that NATO, put President Trump and the US aside for the moment, but NATO is serious about getting involved to support Ukraine, I think that is most likely to put the brakes on Putin's move forward, and most likely to bring him to a ceasefire table than any deals with Trump at the moment. Now, the final piece on this, of course, we are beginning to learn with President Trump and some of his close associates that when they say something that is rebuffed in social media, quite often, 24 hours later, they say something completely the opposite. So, and no doubt, I have in social media myself questioning how President Trump will spin this. Everybody in the world, I think, except for President Trump and his close associates, think that Putin is running rings around him. And I think H.B. McMaster said as such last night, who used to be Trump's security advisor. So I am anticipating in the next 24 hours Trump saying something rather different to what he was saying yesterday. Whether he does or not is probably not going to move the dial. The way to move the dial is Starmer and Macron and the coalition of the willing showing the military might and also the desire to use it if necessary. I think that is what is most likely to halt Putin and bring him to a negotiation table.
Yes, it's very interesting seeing the messages coming out of the Kremlin and seeing the messages coming out of the White House, and indeed then Trump on Truth Social, and where the gaps were, and indeed what was said, and more importantly, what was left out. But moving on to the US saying there's more peace talks with Russia in Saudi Arabia over the weekend. Zelensky has said he wants to be part of those discussions. In your opinion, how likely is that to happen?
Well, I hope the discussions will happen. How likely that Zelensky will be involved? It doesn't seem very likely at the moment because he hasn't been included, which is incredible arrogance, I think, from both sides. It is the Ukrainian people and their president. They are the ones who are attacked. Let's not forget, Russia is the aggressor. It was 24th of February 2022. Russia invaded from Belarus. Russia has been attacking Ukraine. Apart from a small incursion into Kursk in Western Russia in the summer of last year, the Ukrainians have been absolutely on the defensive. So to not include Ukraine at the heart of the discussions, to me, is the height of ignorance and arrogance. So I would hope that Zelensky is there. You sort of get the feeling, though, that these two great men, that they talk a hell of a game, but they don't seem to be brave enough to actually, discuss the elephant in the room, as it were, and that is the Ukraine people, and that is Zelensky. So I would hope if they're going to move forward and get any sort of traction, that Zelensky would be involved directly in talks, in Saudi at the weekend.